The fluorescent lights flickered above bed 7 in the ICU, casting shadows across Maggie Patterson's swollen face. The lump on her chin had grown to the size of an orange, angry red, and pulsing with infection. She clutched her abdomen, protecting the 8-week-old life inside her that no one knew existed until yesterday. Outside the glass door, Helen collapsed against the wall, her arthritic hands pressed against the cold surface. Security had barred her from entering after the screaming match 3 days ago. Secrets. 30 years of secrets now unraveling in the worst possible moment. The surgical countdown clock glared red 6 hours, 13 minutes. Maggie's trembling hand held a pen over a letter she'd started and abandoned twice. To my unborn child, the words blurred through her tears. In 6 hours, she would choose her life or the baby's. There was no guarantee she could save both. The morphine drip couldn't touch the real pain. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 weeks earlier, Maggie Patterson stood before 24 third graders at Lincoln Elementary School in Chicago. Her voice bright with the kind of energy that made children lean forward in their seats. The September morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the colorful alphabet posters that lined the walls. She knelt beside Tommy Anderson's desk, her hands gentle as she helped him tie his shoelaces for the 3rd time that week. "There you go, buddy," she said softly, making sure the other children weren't watching. Tommy's family struggled, and Maggie knew he arrived most mornings without breakfast. She'd started bringing extra granola bars in her desk drawer, slipping them to him discreetly during reading time. At 32, Maggie had built her entire world around taking care of others, her students, her mother, anyone who needed her. It was easier that way, easier than thinking about her own empty apartment, her own unmet needs. After the final bell rang, Maggie drove to her childhood home on Chicago's South Side. The small brick house held decades of memories, though it felt emptier since her father's death 5 years ago. Helen Patterson sat at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through medical bills. "Hi, Mom," Maggie said, setting down grocery bags filled with ingredients for dinner. She'd learned to cook her father's favorite recipes, keeping his memory alive through food. Helen looked up, and Maggie noticed the tiredness in her mother's eyes. At 68. Helen had been managing her newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes for 3 months now. The diagnosis had come as a shock. Though Maggie suspected her mother had been ignoring symptoms for far longer. "You didn't have to come, sweetheart," Helen said, though relief flooded her features. "I know you're busy." "I'm never too busy for you." Maggie checked her mother's blood sugar monitor, noting the numbers in the logbook as she prepared dinner chicken, roasted vegetables, brown rice. She caught sight of an old scar on her mother's chin, faded but still visible. She'd never asked about it, assuming it was from some long-ago accident. "You're my miracle. You know that," Helen said suddenly, watching her daughter move around the familiar kitchen. "My only one." The words carried a weight Maggie didn't quite understand, but she smiled anyway, kissing her mother's forehead before serving dinner. That evening, washing her face before bed in her own bathroom, Maggie's fingers brushed against something unusual on her chin, a small, hard bump beneath the skin, no bigger than a pea. She leaned closer to the mirror, pressing gently. It didn't hurt, didn't look red, Probably just a pimple, she thought. Reaching for her moisturizer, it would go away on its own. They always did. She had more important things to worry about: her mother's health, her students' needs, the stack of papers waiting to be graded. The small bump didn't seem worth mentioning to anyone. 2 weeks later, the bump had transformed into something Maggie could no longer ignore. What began as a small, hard pea beneath her skin now pressed outward with alarming persistence, growing to the size of a large walnut. The skin stretched tight across it, taking on a reddish hue that makeup could barely conceal. Kate Reynolds noticed first. The two teachers had shared a classroom wall for 7 years, and Kate had developed an eye for things people tried to hide. During lunch duty on a Tuesday afternoon, she pulled Maggie aside near the playground equipment. "Maggie, what's going on with your chin?" Kate's voice carried the sharp edge of concern that came from personal experience. 4 years ago, she'd watched her older sister ignore a small mole until stage 4. Melanoma made the decision for her. The funeral had been on a Tuesday, just like this one. "It's nothing," Maggie said, adjusting her scarf to cover the area. "Just a cyst or something. It'll go away." "That doesn't look like nothing." Kate's eyes narrowed. "You need to see a doctor." But Maggie had reasons, good reasons, she told herself, for waiting. Her mother had an important cardiology appointment scheduled for the weekend, a follow-up to address concerning symptoms that had emerged alongside the diabetes. The school was already short-staffed with 2 teachers out on medical leave, and Maggie had committed to covering extra duties. And then there was the insurance situation. Her plan carried a $5,000 deductible she couldn't afford after draining her savings on her father's funeral expenses. The lump continued its relentless growth. By the 3rd week, it had reached the size of a golf ball, the skin now shiny and warm to the touch. Maggie started wearing surgical masks in the classroom, claiming seasonal allergies. The students accepted the explanation without question, though Tommy Anderson approached her desk one morning with worried eyes. "Ms. Patterson, are you sick?" His small voice trembled slightly. Maggie forced brightness into her response. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little under the weather. Nothing to worry about." But she was worried. The pain had started, a deep, throbbing ache that radiated down her and into her neck. Chewing became difficult, then painful, then nearly impossible. She survived on smoothies and soup, watching herself grow gaunt in the bathroom mirror. Kate confronted her again in the teacher's parking lot, this time with less patience and more desperation. "Get in the car. I'm taking you to the emergency room right now." "Kate, I can't." Maggie's voice cracked. "I don't have the money. My checking account has $8,200, and I'm still paying off Dad's funeral. Mom needs—" "You cannot die because you're trying to save money." Kate's shout echoed across the empty parking lot. Tears streamed down her face, and Maggie realized her friend was seeing her sister all over again. "Please, Maggie, please don't do this." They stood there in the October wind, 2 women bound by fear and love and the terrible mathematics of American health care. Finally, Maggie whispered, "2 more days, I promise, after Mom's appointment." Kate wanted to argue, but she saw the steel in Maggie's eyes, the same stubbornness that made her a great teacher and a terrible patient. 2 days, she agreed. not one day more. That night, at 2 in the morning, the pain ripped Maggie from sleep with such ferocity that she bit through her lower lip trying not to scream. Helen found her daughter on the bathroom floor at 3:47 in the morning, curled around herself like a wounded animal. Sweat soaked through Maggie's nightgown, and her fingernails had left crescent-shaped marks in her palms from clenching so hard. The lump on her chin had taken on a purplish hue, the skin so taut it seemed ready to split open. "We're going to the hospital," Helen said, her voice shaking but firm. "Right now, no arguments." The ambulance arrived within minutes. By the time they reached Northwestern Memorial Hospital's emergency department, the sun was just beginning to lighten the Chicago skyline. Emily Foster, the triage nurse on duty, took one look at Maggie's face and immediately called for the attending physician. Dr. Benjamin Harrison had been working in head and neck surgery for 22 years, and he prided himself on remaining calm in crisis situations. But when he examined Maggie in the bright lights of the emergency bay, something in his expression shifted. The mass measured 4.2 centimeters across, with irregular borders and significant inflammation extending into the surrounding tissue. The lymph nodes on both sides of her neck were swollen and tender. "We need imaging immediately," he told Emily. "CT scan should the full blood panel and get surgery on standby." The scans came back within 2 hours. Dr. Harrison studied them with another surgeon, their voices low and serious outside Maggie's room. Helen sat beside her daughter's bed, gripping her hand with the kind of desperate strength that comes from loving someone more than life itself. When Dr. Harrison finally entered, his professional composure was carefully maintained, but Maggie saw the concern in his eyes. "We have several possibilities we need to rule out," he said, pulling up a chair. "It could be a severe abscess originating from dental infection. It might be a tumor of the salivary gland, either benign or malignant. We're also considering a rare type of infection. I've ordered a comprehensive blood workup to help narrow down the diagnosis." Maggie nodded, trying to process the medical terminology through the haze of pain medication they'd given her. "How long until you know?" "The preliminary blood work should be back within a few hours. We may need to do a biopsy depending on those results." Helen's grip on Maggie's hand tightened. Neither of them spoke after Dr. Harrison left. They simply sat together in the fluorescent silence, listening to the beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital waking up to a new day. It was Emily who brought the first results, her young face unusually pale as she entered the room at 4:30 that afternoon. Dr. Harrison followed close behind, and something about the way they moved, careful, deliberate, made Maggie's stomach drop. "There's something we need to discuss," Dr. Harrison began. Sitting down again, he looked at Maggie, then at Helen, then back at Maggie. "Your blood work showed elevated levels of beta-HCG." Maggie stared at him blankly. "I don't understand what that means." "Ms. Patterson," he said gently, "you're pregnant, approximately 8 weeks along." The words didn't make sense at first. They seemed to hang in the air, disconnected from reality. Maggie heard Helen gasp beside her, heard her own voice say, "That's impossible," even though she knew it wasn't. That night, 2 months ago, The anniversary of what would have been her wedding day. Too much wine and a familiar stranger in a hotel bar whose face she could barely remember. "I need you to understand something," Dr. Harrison continued, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. "The antibiotics we typically use to treat severe infections like yours, high-dose penicillin or clindamycin, carry risks for the developing fetus. Surgery and anesthesia also present complications in early pregnancy. However, without aggressive treatment, the infection will continue to spread. It could reach your jawbone, potentially your brain. In that scenario, we would lose both you and the baby." The room tilted. Maggie felt Helen's hand slip from hers, heard her mother's sharp intake of breath from somewhere far away. "You're asking me to choose," Maggie whispered. "I'm asking you to make an informed decision." Dr. Harrison said quietly, "You have 48 hours before the infection becomes immediately life-threatening. We'll monitor you closely during that time. But I need to be honest. Every hour we wait increases the risk." After he left, Helen tried to speak, tried to form words of comfort or wisdom or motherly guidance, but nothing came out. She simply stood there, watching her daughter stare at the blank hospital wall, and understood that some decisions are so terrible that love itself falls silent before them. Dr. Harrison assembled an emergency consultation team the following morning. 3 specialists gathered around Maggie's case file, like generals planning a dangerous campaign. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from obstetrics, Dr. James Cooper from infectious disease, and Harrison himself represented the triumvirate that would attempt what felt increasingly impossible, saving both mother and child. "There's an alternative protocol," Dr. Cooper proposed, spreading research papers across the conference table. "Azithromycin in high doses. It's pregnancy category B, significantly safer for fetal development than our typical treatments. We'd need to monitor constantly, run daily ultrasounds, watch for any sign of distress. If we don't see improvement within 72 hours, we operate immediately." It was a gamble, and everyone in that room knew it. But it was the only option that didn't force Maggie to choose between her life and her child's. When they presented the plan, Maggie's voice was barely audible. "Do whatever you need to do. Just please, please save my baby." She signed the consent forms with trembling hands, each signature an act of faith and desperation. The treatment began immediately, IV antibiotics flowing through her veins, alongside fluids and pain medication carefully calibrated to avoid harming the 8-week fetus, whose heartbeat appeared on the ultrasound screen like a tiny, determined flutter. Kate arrived that evening to find Maggie hooked up to multiple monitors, her face half covered in bandages from the needle biopsy they'd performed to identify the exact pathogen. Without a word, Kate pulled out her laptop and began typing. "What are you doing?" Maggie asked. "Something I should have done days ago." His fingers flew across the keyboard. Within 20 minutes, she'd created a GoFundMe page titled "Help Save Maggie and Her Baby." The story poured out Maggie's dedication to her students, her sacrifice for her mother, the impossible choice she now faced. Kate hit publish and shared it across every social media platform she could access. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By midnight, 240 people had donated over $12,000. Local news picked up the story the next morning. By evening, the total had climbed to $28,600. Lincoln Elementary School transformed into a hub of activity. The third graders made cards, their careful printing spelling out messages of hope and love. Tommy Anderson appeared at the school office with his piggy bank, insisting that all $47 of his life savings go to Ms. Patterson. The principal didn't have the heart to refuse him. At St. Mary's Parish, Helen lit candles every morning and evening. The congregation organized a prayer vigil, 50 people gathering in the cold October night to hold candles and whisper appeals to whatever power might be listening. The priest's wife organized a bake sale. The youth group started a car wash. Money trickled in from everywhere, small amounts that added up to something miraculous. In her hospital room, Maggie read the letters from her students, tears streaming down her swollen face. Tommy's letter was printed in careful block letters. Ms. Patterson is my hero. She helped me when I had no breakfast. Now I want to help her. And she pressed the paper to her chest and sobbed not from pain, but from the crushing weight of being loved by so many people when she felt so unworthy. On the third day, Dr. Harrison entered with the biopsy results. Actinomycosis, he announced, relief evident in his voice. It's a bacterial infection caused by actinomyces, organisms that normally live harmlessly in your mouth. They become dangerous when they penetrate deep tissue, which likely happened through the trauma from your impacted wisdom tooth months ago. He explained that it was extraordinarily rare, affecting perhaps 1 in 300,000 people annually. Finding it on the chin was rarer still. But the crucial detail was this: it could be treated with antibiotics. Not quickly or easily, but successfully. 6 to 8 weeks of high-dose therapy, careful monitoring, but no immediate surgery required. "The baby," Maggie whispered. Mitchell stepped forward, her ultrasound wand already in hand. She applied gel to Maggie's abdomen and moved the device slowly until the familiar flutter appeared on screen. Heartbeat is strong, 135 beats per minute. Everything looks good. Hope, fragile as spun glass, began to form in Maggie's chest. But that hope shattered at 11 o'clock that night when Maggie woke to cramping pain in her abdomen, different from the infection, sharper and lower. She pressed the call button with shaking hands. Emily rushed in, took one look at Maggie's face, and hit the emergency alert. Mitchell arrived within minutes, portable ultrasound in hand. The room fell silent as she searched for the heartbeat. Seconds stretched into eternities. The whooshing sound of Maggie's own pulse filled the speakers. Then, finally, a faster rhythm emerged, but slower than before. 100 beats per minute. Dangerous territory. "We're out of time," Dr. Harrison said from the doorway. "Surgery tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Helen, who had been dozing in the chair, jerked awake. "What's happening?" But Maggie couldn't answer. She could only stare at the ceiling tiles and count them over and over, trying to find some pattern that would tell her everything would be okay. Emily stayed past her shift's end, pulling up a chair beside Maggie's bed. In the dim light, she spoke quietly about her own past, a baby lost 3 years ago because she'd waited too long to seek treatment for what seemed like minor complications. "I won't let that happen to you," Emily promised, squeezing Maggie's hand. "I'll be here all night. I'll watch every monitor. You're not alone." As dawn approached, Maggie pulled out the hospital stationery and began writing a letter to the child inside her. "My dear baby," she wrote, her handwriting shaky. "I don't know if you'll ever read this." The words blurred through her tears. She tried again, crumpled the paper, started over. Each attempt felt more impossible than the last. 9 hours until surgery. 8, 7. The numbers counted down like a pulse, marking time until Maggie would have to trust strangers with everything she'd ever loved. Maggie hadn't slept. She'd spent the night staring at the ultrasound image taped to the wall beside her bed, a grainy photograph showing a small shape that looked more like a comma than a human being, but whose heartbeat had become the center of her universe. As dawn broke over Chicago, she carefully cut a lock of her hair with the disposable scissors from her meal tray, sealing it in a small envelope. If she didn't survive, this child would at least have something tangible from the mother who'd tried. At 6 in the morning, the surgical team gathered in Dr. Harrison's office. 5 people hunched over computer screens displaying Maggie's scans from every possible angle. The infection had created pockets of fluid throughout the tissue, dangerous caverns that would need to be drained and cleaned. The procedure itself was straightforward in theory, but the pregnancy complicated everything: the anesthesia dosing, the positioning on the table, the medications they could use for pain management afterward. "Best case scenario, we save both," Dr. Harrison said, his finger tracing the infected area on the screen. 60% probability, 30% chance we lose the fetus, but save Maggie. 10% chance of severe complications for both. Nobody mentioned the unspoken decimal points beyond that 10%. The possibilities too dark to voice aloud in the sterile morning light. Helen stood outside Maggie's door at 7:30, her hand raised to knock. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, trying to find the courage to face her daughter. A security guard had been posted after their argument 3 days ago, Maggie's request, a barrier between them that felt more permanent than any locked door. Emily emerged from the room and nearly collided with her. "Mrs. Patterson," she said gently, "she's asking for you." The guard stepped aside. Helen pushed open the door to find her daughter sitting upright in bed, hands folded in her lap like a child waiting for punishment. The swelling had worsened overnight, distorting Maggie's face into something Helen barely recognized. But it was her daughter's eyes that broke her heart, red-rimmed and empty, as though all the tears had finally run dry. "I need to tell you something before I go into there," Maggie said, her voice flat and mechanical. "You've been hiding something from me. I can feel it. I've always felt it." Helen's legs went weak. She gripped the doorframe for support. "Whatever it is," Maggie continued, "I need to know now. Not after surgery, not when I wake up, if I wake up, now." The silence stretched between them like an ocean. Helen opened her mouth, but decades of carefully constructed protection rose up to stop the words. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time. When is the time?" Maggie's voice cracked, the first real emotion breaking through. "When I'm in that operating room, when I'm gone, when is it ever going to be the right time to stop lying to me? I never lied to you." "Then what do you call hiding the truth?" Maggie's hands clenched the bedsheet. "I see it in your eyes every time you look at this thing on my face. You're not just scared. You're remembering something. What is it, Mom? What happened to you?" Helen felt the walls closing in. 30 years of secrets pressing against her chest. "Please," she whispered, "let me tell you after." "There might not be an after," Maggie shouted, then immediately pressed her hand to her abdomen, as if apologizing to the life inside her for the outburst. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "If I die in there, I die not knowing. Is that what you want?" The door opened. Dr. Harrison and his team stood in the hallway, scrubs on, masks dangling around their necks. "Miss Patterson," he said quietly, "it's time." Helen stepped forward, reaching for her daughter's hand, but Maggie turned her face to the wall. "Get out," she whispered. "Maggie, please, get out." The security guard gently guided Helen into the hallway. The last thing she saw before the door closed was her daughter's shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and Emily climbing onto the bed to hold her the way Helen should have been holding her. The waiting room filled slowly. Kate arrived first, her eyes swollen from crying. She wrapped her arms around Helen without speaking, and the two women stood together like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. By 8 o'clock, the space had filled with nearly 30 people teachers from Lincoln Elementary, parents of Maggie's students, members of St. Mary's congregation, even strangers who'd read about her story online and felt compelled to bear witness. Tommy sat in the corner with his mother, his small hands folded in prayer, even though he was only 9 and didn't fully understand what prayer meant. He just knew that Ms. Patterson had given him granola bars when his stomach hurt from hunger. And that seemed like the kind of person worth praying for. The surgery began at 9:17. Helen watched the second hand of the waiting room clock sweep around the face. Each revolution marking 60 seconds her daughter spent under anesthesia, under the knife, teetering between life and death. Kate held her hand so tightly that both their fingers went numb, but neither let go. At 11:47, a nurse rushed past the waiting room toward the operating wing. She moved with controlled urgency, not quite running, but close enough to send ripples of panic through the assembled crowd. Helen stood up. Kate pulled her back down. At 1:20, Cooper burst through the doors and jogged down the hall. Someone in the waiting room began to cry. Helen felt her vision narrow to a pinpoint of light. At 2:15, the neonatal intensive care team was summoned over the intercom. Helen's legs gave out. Kate and the priest caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her into a chair as the room spun. Her blood sugar had plummeted, the stress and skipped meals finally catching up with her diabetes. Someone produced orange juice. Someone else called for a wheelchair. "I'm fine," Helen insisted, pushing away the concerned hands. "I'm not leaving. I'm not." But her body betrayed her. The room tilted sideways and went dark. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a gurney in a small examination room down the hall, Kate's worried face hovering above her. "They're finishing up," Kate said quickly. "You've only been out for 10 minutes, dear. They're closing now. It's almost over." Helen struggled to sit up. "The baby." Kate's expression wavered. "I don't know yet. Dr. Harrison is coming to talk to everyone soon." They wheeled Helen back to the waiting room, where she refused to lie down despite the nurse's protests. She sat upright on the gurney, hands gripping the rails, waiting for news that would either rebuild her world or shatter it completely. At 3:47, the operating room doors swung open. Dr. Harrison emerged, still in his surgical scrubs, his mask pulled down to reveal an expression that was impossible to read. Every person in the waiting room stood. The collective held breath of 30 people created a vacuum of sound. He walked toward Helen with measured steps. Time slowed. She saw individual beads of sweat on his forehead, noticed a small coffee stain on his scrub top, counted his footsteps, 7, 8, 9, until he stood directly in front of her. His mouth opened. The words that came out would change everything. "The surgery was successful," De Harrison said, and the collective exhale in the waiting room sounded like wind through trees. But he held up his hand before relief could fully settle. "However, the baby is extremely fragile. The next 48 hours are critical. We are monitoring constantly. But I need everyone to understand we're not out of danger yet." Helen's head dropped forward, caught between gratitude and terror. Kate's arms wrapped around her shoulders, holding her upright. "Can I see her?" Helen whispered. "She's in recovery. Another hour. Then immediate family only." De Harrison's gaze was kind but firm. "Mrs. Patterson, I need you to understand something. Your daughter is going to need support, not stress. Whatever issues exist between you two, they need to wait until she's stronger." Helen nodded, though shame burned in her throat. Even now, even after everything, she couldn't speak the truth that had been lodged in her chest for 3 decades. Maggie woke to white ceiling tiles and the distinctive smell of disinfectant. Her first conscious thought was to touch her abdomen, and when her trembling hand made contact, she held her breath, waiting for some instinctive knowledge of loss or presence. Emily appeared beside her, as if summoned by thought alone. Without speaking, she wheeled over a portable ultrasound machine and squeezed gel onto Maggie's stomach. The wand moved in slow circles until sound filled the room, a rapid flutter like hummingbird wings. 125 beats per minute, Emily said softly. "Your baby's still fighting." Maggie turned her face into the pillow and wept with a relief so profound it felt like drowning and breathing air for the first time simultaneously. The next afternoon, after 24 hours of stable vitals and no complications, Maggie was moved from recovery to a standard room. Helen came to visit 3 times, and 3 times Maggie turned her face to the wall without speaking. The anger hadn't dissipated with the surgery. If anything, coming so close to death had sharpened it, made it more urgent. Life was too short for secrets, and Maggie was tired of living in the shadow of truths nobody would speak. Kate tried to mediate on the second day. "She's been sitting outside your door for hours," she said gently. "She almost died from the stress. Maggie, her blood sugar crashed. She's not well. Then she should go home and rest. She won't leave without talking to you." "Then I guess she's going to be here a long time." On the 3rd day after surgery, a man appeared in Maggie's doorway. He was tall, well-dressed in a gray suit that looked expensive, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. Maggie stared at him for a long moment before recognition crashed over her like cold water. "David!" she breathed. David Thompson, her ex-husband, the man who'd left her 2 years ago with accusations of inadequacy still ringing in her ears, stood there looking like he'd aged a decade since she'd last seen him. His hands twisted together, a nervous gesture she remembered from their marriage. "I heard you were here," he said quietly. "Kate told me about the baby." Maggie's hand instinctively covered her abdomen. "What do you want to talk? Just for a minute. Please?" She should have said no. Should have called security. but something in his expression of brokenness she recognized because she'd worn it herself for 2 years made her nod. David approached slowly, as if she might bolt. He sat in the chair beside her bed, the one Helen had occupied for days, and for a long moment he simply looked at his hands. "I got tested," he said finally, 2 months ago, after Jessica and I had been trying for a year with no results. He looked up, and Maggie saw tears tracking down his face. "I'm sterile, Maggie. Severely low sperm count, almost zero motility. The doctor said it's probably been that way for years, maybe since we met." The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie's mind raced backward, rewriting history with this new information. The miscarriage 2 years ago, David's cruel words afterward, his insistence that something was wrong with her, his abandonment, all of it built on a lie he hadn't known he was telling. "When you lost the baby," David continued, his voice breaking, "I blamed you because I couldn't face the possibility that it might be me. And when we tried again and nothing happened, it was easier to leave than to get tested and know for sure." He wiped his face with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry. God, Maggie, I'm so sorry. You spent 2 years thinking you were broken, and it was me. It was always me." Maggie felt something crack open in her chest, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "That night," she whispered, "2 months ago, our anniversary, you called, and I was drunk, and you said you needed to talk. I'd just gotten the test results. I wanted to tell you, to apologize. When you agreed to meet me, I thought maybe I could fix it somehow." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I had too much wine and made everything worse. The baby is yours, yes." The word came out like a prayer, a miracle I don't deserve. "But Maggie, you need to know I'm not here to ask for anything. You don't owe me forgiveness or a second chance or access to this child. I just needed you to know that you were never the problem. You're perfect. You always were." Kate found them an hour later, David kneeling beside Maggie's bed with his head in his hands, Maggie stroking his hair while tears streamed down both their faces. She backed quietly out of the room, her own eyes burning, and found Helen sitting on the floor outside. "She'll talk to you," Kate said gently. "Just give her a little more time." But it wasn't temp that brought mother and daughter back together. It was Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The obstetrician arrived the following afternoon with a warm smile and professional demeanor, introducing herself as she set up the portable ultrasound machine. "I'll be managing your prenatal care from here forward," she explained. "Dr. Harrison asked me to take over, since we're past the immediate crisis." Something about the woman felt familiar to Maggie, though she couldn't place it. Dr. Mitchell was thorough, kind, spending extra time checking every measurement and explaining each finding in detail. She came back that evening to check again, and then the next morning, and the next evening, 3 times a day, instead of the standard once daily monitoring. "You're very dedicated," Maggie observed during the 5th visit. "Every baby deserves the best care possible," Dr. Mitchell replied, but something flickered in her expression, a shadow of pain, quickly hidden. Kate noticed it too. That night, unable to sleep, she Googled Dr. Sarah Mitchell Northwestern Memorial on her phone. The search results included a professional profile, several medical papers, and a society page photograph from 2 years earlier. In it, Dr. Mitchell stood beside a handsome man in a tuxedo at some hospital charity gala. The man was David Thompson. Kate's investigation revealed the truth within an hour. Sarah Mitchell had married David Thompson 18 months ago. They lived in a townhouse in Lincoln Park. There were no children listed on any public records. "Does Maggie know?" Kate demanded the next morning, cornering Dr. Mitchell in the hallway outside Maggie's room. Dr. Mitchell's composure cracked just slightly. "No." "You're his wife." "Yes." "Why are you doing this? Why are you taking care of his ex-wife's baby?" Dr. Mitchell looked at Kate for a long moment, and something in her eyes was older than her years. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply, "and because that baby didn't choose any of this." Later that afternoon, after Kate had wrestled with her conscience and lost, she sat down beside Maggie and told her everything. The revelation should have made Maggie angry, should have felt like betrayal or manipulation or some twisted game. Instead, she found herself crying for a woman she barely knew, a woman who loved a man enough to save the child he'd created with someone else. When Dr. Mitchell came for the evening checkup, Maggie stopped her before she could set up the equipment. "I know who you are," she said quietly. Dr. Mitchell froze, her hand on the ultrasound machine. She straightened slowly, her professional mask slipping to reveal the raw pain underneath. "I see. Why are you really here?" The question hung between them. Dr. Mitchell sank into the visitor's chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "David and I tried for 2 years to have a baby," she said. "When we found out he was sterile, I told him I didn't care, that we could adopt or foster or just be the two of us. I meant it." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But he couldn't accept it, and I knew, even before he said anything, that he still loved you, that he'd always loved you." "I'm sorry," Maggie said, and meant it. "Don't be. This baby," Dr. Mitchell gestured to Maggie's abdomen, "deserves every chance at life, regardless of who the father is or what I feel about it. I took an oath to do no harm. That includes setting aside my own pain to do what's right." They sat in silence for a moment, two women connected by one man's past and future, bound by circumstances neither had chosen. "He doesn't deserve you," Maggie finally said. Dr. Mitchell laughed, but it sounded like crying. "Maybe not, but that little one deserves both of you." She stood, smoothing her white coat. "I'll finish monitoring through your pregnancy. After the birth, I'll step away. But until then, I'm going to make sure your baby has the best possible start." Helen learned about all of this from Kate, who felt someone should know the full complexity of what was happening. The knowledge pushed her past her fear, past the decades of protective silence. That night, she marched past the nurse's station and into Maggie's room with the determination of someone who'd finally run out of time to be a coward. "We need to talk," Helen said before Maggie could protest. "And this time, I'm not leaving until you hear everything." Maggie stared at her mother, really looked at her for the first time in days, and saw how much weight she'd lost, how the skin hung loose on her frame, how her hands trembled with more than age. 30 years ago," Helen began, her voice shaking but steady, "I stood where you're standing now, in a hospital room, 8 weeks pregnant, with an infection the doctors had never seen before. She touched the faded scar on her chin. Actinomycel, same as yours. Same location, same progression, same impossible choice. Maggie's breath caught. I chose you, Helen continued. I delayed treatment because the medications might harm you. I endured 6 weeks of the least effective antibiotics because they were the safest for pregnancy. The infection damaged tissue, nerves, glands. After you were born, I learned I'd never have another child. The scar tissue, the repeated infections, my body couldn't sustain another pregnancy. Tears streamed down her face now. 30 years of held grief, finally finding release. You were my only miracle, my only chance. And I spent every day since then terrified that you'd inherited the same weakness, that you'd face the same choice. That history would repeat itself, and I'd lose you to the same thing that took my fertility. Why didn't you tell me? Maggie whispered. Because I didn't want you to be afraid. I didn't want you to look at your own body as defective or dangerous. I wanted you to have a normal life, free from my trauma. Helen sank onto the edge of the bed. But I see now that secrets cause their own kind of damage. You had a right to know, to understand, to prepare. Jaggy reached for her mother's hand, the first voluntary touch between them in days, and held it tight. You lived with pain for 30 years because of me. I lived because of you. You were worth every second of it. They cried together then, mother and daughter. 2 women separated by 3 decades, but united by the same terrible choice, the same fierce love, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for the life growing inside them. I'm sorry I shut you out, Maggie said finally. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with the truth sooner. Helen climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, lying beside her daughter the way she had when Maggie was small and frightened by thunderstorms. They lay there in the dim light, hand in hand, watching the monitor beside the bed trace the steady heartbeat of the 3rd generation, a baby who would be born free of the genetic shadow that had haunted her mother and grandmother. The infection began to retreat. Over the next week, the angry redness faded to pink, then to the pale color of healing skin. The swelling decreased daily until Maggie could see the contours of her own face again in the mirror. The mass that had dominated her chin shrank to 60% of its original size, then 85%, leaving behind only a small tilt or a tender area that Dr. Harrison assured her would continue to improve. Most importantly, the baby thrived. At 9 weeks, the ultrasound showed a tiny form with distinguishable features, the beginning of arms and legs. A head distinct from the body. The heartbeat remained strong at 135 beats per minute, a sound that had become the rhythm by which Maggie measured time. Helen moved Ash into the hospital room, sleeping in the reclining chair beside Maggie's bed. Hospital policy technically forbade it, but Emily looked the other way, understanding that some healing required proximity. Mother and daughter talked through the nights when pain or anxiety kept Maggie awake, conversations that spanned 30 years of unspoken things, gentle excavations of buried hurt and hidden love. Tell me about Dad, Maggie said one night, about when you were pregnant with me. Helen's face softened with memory. He was terrified. Your father was a brave man in many ways, but the thought of being responsible for a tiny human paralyzed him. She laughed quietly. When you were born and they put you in his arms, he cried like a baby himself, said you were the most perfect thing he'd ever seen. I miss him. So do I. Every single day. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand. But he'd be so proud of you, of how strong you've been. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't the absence of fear, sweetheart. It's doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. David came every day, always asking permission before entering, never staying long. He brought Practical Things magazines, decent coffee, warm socks because the hospital was always cold. He asked about Maggie's comfort and the baby's health, but never pressed for more than she offered. The man who'd left her 2 years ago seemed to have been replaced by someone humbler, more careful, aware of how much trust he'd broken and how long it would take to rebuild. On the 4th day, Maggie asked him about Sarah. David's face crumpled. I've destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me, he said quietly. She's a better person than I'll ever be. She deserved honesty from the beginning, and instead I gave her half-truths and unfair expectations. She's still taking care of the baby. I know. That's who she is, someone who does what's right even when it costs her everything. He looked at Maggie with eyes full of regret. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything, but if you'll let me, I want to be the father this child deserves. Not the man I was, but the man I should have been all along. Maggie studied him for a long moment. I don't love you anymore, she said, and watched him flinch. I'm not sure I even like you yet, but I want my child to have a father who shows up. Can you do that? Yes. I swear to you, yes. Then we'll figure it out, one day at a time. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was possibility. And in that hospital room, possibility felt like grace. Sarah Mitchell came for her evening ultrasound on the 6th day, and Maggie stopped her with a question that had been building for days. Do you regret it, taking care of me, knowing what it means? Sarah set down the ultrasound wand and met Maggie's gaze directly. I regret a lot of things, she said honestly. I regret marrying a man who wasn't fully mine. I regret not seeing the truth sooner. But taking care of you and this baby, no, that's the one thing I don't regret. I don't understand how you can separate it like that, because that baby isn't responsible for the choices adults made, because every life deserves someone fighting for it, and because her voice wavered slightly. Maybe doing something truly selfless, something that costs me personally but saves someone else, is how I'll learn to live with everything I can't change. Maggie felt tears burning her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, for giving us a chance when you didn't have to. You're welcome. Sarah squeezed Maggie's hand briefly, then pulled back into professional mode. Now, let's check on this little one. The ultrasound revealed what they'd been hoping for, continued growth, strong cardiac activity, no signs of distress. Sarah printed several images and handed them to Maggie with a small smile. Perfect! Everything is perfect. After she left, Kate arrived with an envelope that had been delivered to the school. Inside were printouts from the GoFundMe campaign pages and pages of donations with attached messages. 2,300 people had contributed a total of $156,000, but there was more. An anonymous donor had added $100,000 in a single transaction 2 days earlier. Who would give that much? Maggie asked, stunned. Kate looked uncomfortable. I have a theory, but I haven't confirmed it. Tell me. I think it was Sarah Mitchell. The words settled over Maggie like snow. She looked at the anonymous donation again, and suddenly it made a terrible kind of sense. A woman giving away the money she might have used for adoption or fertility treatments, redirecting it toward the child she'd never have with the man she loved. That night, Maggie asked to see the hospital billing department. The financial counselor arrived with a thick folder containing invoices that made Maggie's stomach turn. 6 weeks of treatment, surgery, intensive monitoring. The total came to $187,600. Her insurance had denied the claim, citing the delay in seeking treatment as evidence of a pre-existing condition. How much do I owe right now? Maggie asked, her voice barely steady. With what your insurance is covering, essentially just the emergency room visit, you're responsible for $173,000. The number was incomprehensible, more than Maggie would earn in 4 years of teaching. Enough to bankrupt her, to take Helen's house, to destroy the small stability they'd built. But then Kate pulled out her phone and showed her the GoFundMe total. Now at $256,000 after the anonymous donation. You're covered, Kate said, tears in her eyes. The community took care of you. You can pay the hospital and still have money left for the baby. Maggie dissolved into sobs, not of grief this time, but of overwhelming gratitude for a world that had revealed itself to be kinder than she'd imagined possible. Strangers had looked at her story and decided she was worth saving. Students had emptied piggy banks. Teachers had given from already tight budgets. And somewhere, a woman who had every reason to hate her had given more than anyone, asking for nothing in return. On the 7th day, Maggie was cleared to go home. The infection had been reduced to manageable levels, requiring only oral antibiotics for the next 4 weeks. The baby measured on track for 10 weeks gestation. The worst was behind them. Emily hugged Maggie goodbye with tears streaming down her face. You reminded me why I became a nurse, she said. Thank you for that. Dr. Harrison shook her hand formally, but his eyes were warm. You taught an old doctor that miracles still happen. Take care of yourself and that baby. And Kate arrived with a car full of balloons sent by Maggie's students, each one bearing a hand-drawn picture or message. Tommy had made one that showed Ms. Patterson holding a baby, both of them smiling, with the words, "My hero," written in careful letters across the top. Helen wheeled Maggie to the hospital entrance, while David carried the bags of medication, instructions, and baby books that various staff members had given them. The Chicago autumn air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Maggie breathed it in deeply, the first fresh air she'd tasted in nearly a month. As they drove through the city toward Helen's house, Maggie watched the familiar streets pass by and felt something shift inside her. She was going home not just to a physical place, but to a life that had been broken and was slowly being rebuilt into something different, something perhaps even stronger than before. She placed her hand over her abdomen, feeling nothing yet but knowing life was there, growing despite everything that had tried to stop it. "We made it," she whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "We actually made it." But even in that moment of relief, she didn't know about the final twist waiting in the results of genetic testing that Dr. Harrison had ordered during her stay, results that would arrive 2 days later with news that would rewrite everything she understood about her family's history and her daughter's future. 6 months passed like a prayer, answered slowly. Spring arrived in Chicago with its usual dramatic flair, transforming the gray cityscape into something softer, greener, full of possibility. Maggie's belly had grown round and firm, the baby inside her active and strong, kicking whenever Maggie tried to sleep and settling into stillness during the day. She'd returned to teaching after 3 months, welcomed back by her students with such enthusiasm that she'd cried in the school parking lot before even making it inside. At 38 weeks, on a Tuesday morning, when the cherry blossoms were just beginning to bloom along Lakeshore Drive, Maggie woke to the first contraction. It felt like a wave rolling through her body, intense but manageable. She breathed through it the way she'd practiced in the birthing classes David had attended with her. His presence tentative but constant over the past months. By noon, the contractions were 5 minutes apart. Helen drove her to Northwestern Memorial while David met them there, looking more terrified than Maggie had ever seen him. They settled into the labor and delivery room, a space designed to feel less clinical than the rest of the hospital, with soft lighting and a rocking chair and curtains instead of blinds. The labor progressed slowly at first, then with increasing intensity as afternoon bled into evening. Helen held Maggie's left hand while David held her right, both of them bearing the crushing strength of her grip during contractions without complaint. Between contractions, they talked about small things, baby names they debated, the nursery Helen had prepared in her house, the tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small. At 3:42 in the morning, after 17 hours of labor, Dr. Mitchell delivered a baby girl weighing 6 pounds and 12 ounces. The infant emerged screaming, her face red and furious at being evicted from her warm home into the bright, unpillored world. The sound was the most beautiful thing Maggie had ever heard. "She's perfect," Dr. Mitchell said, her professional composure cracking slightly as she placed the baby on Maggie's chest. "Absolutely perfect." Maggie looked down at the tiny wrinkled face, the eyes squeezed shut against the light, the small fists waving in protest at everything. Overwhelming love crashed over her, so intense it felt like drowning and flying simultaneously. "Hello, baby girl," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you." Helen leaned over them both, her own face wet with tears. "She has your father's chin," she said to Maggie, "and your eyes." David stood frozen on the other side of the bed, staring at his daughter with an expression of such profound awe that it transformed his entire face. When the nurse finally placed the cleaned and swaddled infant in his arms, he dropped to his knees beside the bed, cradling her with the careful reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "I'm your daddy," he whispered to her, "and I promise you, I swear to you, I will spend every day of my life being worthy of you." The baby opened her eyes then, dark blue and unfocused, searching the blurry shapes around her for something familiar. She quieted at the sound of David's voice, and Maggie watched as her ex-husband fell completely in love with someone for perhaps the first time in his life. Her name is Hope, Maggie announced. Hope Grace Patterson. It's perfect, Helen said. She's our second miracle. They discharged Maggie 2 days later, declaring both mother and baby healthy and ready to go home. Helen had transformed her own bedroom into a nursery, insisting that Maggie and Hope should stay with her for the first few months. The room held a crib her father had built decades ago when Maggie was born, now refinished and painted white, along with a rocking chair and a changing table and more baby clothes than one infant could possibly wear. The first week was a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning Hope's different cries and what they meant, of staring at her sleeping face and feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping this tiny human alive. Helen proved invaluable, taking the 3 a.m. feeding so Maggie could sleep for a 4 hour stretch, teaching her daughter all the small tricks that only experience provides. David came every evening after work, arriving with dinner for Helen and Maggie, then spending hours simply holding his daughter and staring at her in wonder. He'd sit in the rocking chair with Hope, sleeping on his chest, sometimes for 2 hours straight, unwilling to move and disturb her even when his arms cramped and his back ached. "You're a natural," Maggie observed one evening, watching him from the doorway. "I'm terrified I'm going to break her," he admitted. "She's so small. She's tougher than she looks. We all are." Something passed between them in that moment, not romance, but understanding. They would never be what they'd once tried to be, but they could be something else, co-parents, friends, perhaps. Two people united in their love for this child, even if they couldn't quite love each other. Sarah Mitchell sent a gift, a handmade baby blanket in soft yellow with Hope's name embroidered in the corner. The card simply read, "Congratulations on your beautiful miracle, S." Maggie held the blanket and cried for a woman she barely knew but would never forget. A woman who'd chosen grace when anger would have been easier, 4 months after Hope's birth. Maggie returned to Lincoln Elementary. The school had thrown a welcome back party, the hallways decorated with banners and balloons. Her students, now 4th graders, lined up to see pictures of the baby, each one wanting to hold the photos and declare Hope the cutest baby ever born. Tommy stood at the back of the line, waiting until the others had dispersed before approaching Maggie's desk. He'd grown taller over the past year, his voice beginning to crack in that awkward way of boys approaching adolescence. "I prayed for you every night, Miss Patterson," he said quietly. "I asked God to keep you and your baby safe." Maggie knelt down to his level and pulled him into a hug. "Those prayers worked, Tommy. They really did. Can I see her?" The baby. Maggie pulled out her phone and showed him the photos. Hope sleeping, Hope in the bath, Hope making a surprised face at the camera. Tommy studied each one carefully, a smile spreading across his face. "She's lucky," he said, "to have you as her mom." "I'm the lucky one," Maggie replied. "I have her, and I have students like you who remind me what matters." Kate found Maggie in the classroom after school, sitting at her desk grading papers while the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows. Her friend pulled up a chair and simply sat for a moment, both of them existing in the comfortable silence of people who'd survived something terrible together. "How are you, really?" Kate finally asked. "Tired, terrified, completely in love," Maggie smiled. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and the best. Sarah Mitchell is leaving Northwestern, Kate said carefully. I heard from someone in the hospital auxiliary she's taking a position in Denver. Maggie absorbed this news quietly. Does David know? I assume so. They filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. It's amicable, apparently, or as amicable as these things can be. I should write to her, Maggie said. Thank her properly. I think that would mean a lot. That evening, after Hope was asleep and Helen had retired to the guest room, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen. She wrote 3 drafts before settling on something that felt true. Dear Sarah, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my daughter's life when you had every reason to walk away. You chose compassion over bitterness. And I will make sure Hope knows, when she's old enough to understand, that she exists because of your grace. I hope Denver brings you the happiness you deserve. With gratitude and respect, Maggie. She mailed it the next morning, uncertain if Sarah would even read it, but needing to send it anyway. On a warm Saturday in May, 6 months after Hope's birth, Maggie pushed the stroller through Millennium Park while Helen walked beside her and David carried the diaper bag. They made an unusual family, fractured and reassembled in a configuration that didn't match any traditional pattern. But they made it work. Hope had grown into a happy baby with her father's dark hair and Maggie's smile. She laughed easily, reached for everything, and had recently discovered her toes, which she found endlessly fascinating. Watching her discover the world made everything Maggie had endured feel worthwhile, necessary, even the price of admission to this particular joy. They stopped at the Crown Fountain, where children ran through the water jets despite the coolness of the spring day. Hope watched them with wide eyes, her head turning to follow their movement. Maggie lifted her from the stroller and held her up, letting her daughter see the world from a higher vantage point. Look at all the people, Maggie whispered to her. Look at the beautiful world you get to grow up in. Helen came to stand beside them, her hand resting gently on Maggie's shoulder. 3 generations of women, grandmother, mother, daughter, connected by biology and trauma, and an almost unbearable love that had seen them through the worst and brought them here to this moment of simple peace. We made it, baby girl, Maggie murmured, kissing Hope's soft head, the same words she'd whispered in the hospital, but now with the certainty of survival behind them. We actually made it. Hope grabbed her mother's finger and squeezed, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. In that grip, Maggie felt the future, all the school plays and skinned knees and homework struggles and teenage arguments and eventual triumphs that would make up this child's life, all of it waiting to be lived, all of it possible because 3 women had refused to give up and 1 woman had chosen kindness over anger. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and pink. David took photos with his phone, Maggie and Hope, Helen with her granddaughter, all of them together beneath the spring sky. These moments, these ordinary miracles, were what life was made of after survival, not dramatic, not cinematic, just quietly beautiful in the way that matters most. They walked home slowly, taking the long route through the park, in no hurry to reach anywhere because they'd already arrived at the only destination that mattered, a place where love was messy and imperfect, and sometimes came from unexpected sources, but was always, always enough. If you're reading this story, maybe you've been ignoring something too. A pain that whispers instead of screams. A symptom you've convinced yourself will disappear on its own. We tell ourselves we don't have time. We don't have money. We don't want to burden anyone. Maggie thought the same thing, and it nearly cost her everything. Your body speaks truth even when your mind wants to deny it. Listen to it. That small change, that persistent ache, that thing you keep dismissing, it matters. The people who love you need you here, not someday, not after you've taken care of everyone else, but right now. This story isn't just about surviving a medical crisis. It's about the power of community, the grace of strangers, and the fierce love that binds families together even when secrets threaten to tear them apart. It's about second chances and the courage to accept help when pride tells you to suffer alone. Helen carried her secret for 30 years, trying to protect her daughter. But sometimes the greatest act of love is vulnerability, trusting others with our truth, our pain, our need. Have you ever ignored a health warning that turned out to be serious? What would you tell someone who's putting off getting help right now? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might save someone's life.